You stand on the shore of the ocean watching the tide come in. You sense the call of the sea beckoning to take you further. You step forward little by little, not knowing what to expect, but expecting more. You keep going as the ocean calls you to enter in to deeper waters.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Deeper Waters podcast. I am Nick Peters, your host, seeking to bring you the very best in Christian scholarship and apologetics. And today is no exception, and well, this is Christmas month, so why not talk about Christmas topics? And one of them is the idea that Christianity really begins the announcement of one of my favorite topics you'll see talked about on my Facebook page, the virgin birth, which I do affirm. Now, what is the virgin birth though? Is it true? What difference does it make even if it is true? Is this just God, like showing off or something like that? Or was it done to avoid the paternal sin passed down through Adam or something like that? Well, in order to discuss this, I've decided to bring on Dr. Richard Shenk, who wrote the book, The Virgin Birth of Christ. He has his Bachelor's of Science from Wheaton College and a physicist at Fermi National. He celebrated that from 1979 to 86, and apparently went to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School for his MDiv in 1984, pastor of General Baptist General Conference, Ogalia, Nebraska, 1986 to 1991, Mundelein, Illinois, 1992 to 2007. He was a pastor of Evangelical Free Church. He got his PhD from the University of Wales, Lancaster. And he's an adjunct professor at Theology Bethlehem College and Seminary. He was from 2009 to 17, and apparently he still is from 2017 to present. So, Dr. Shenk, welcome to the Deeper Waters podcast.
Thank you, Nick. Good to be with you.
Now, how did you get to be doing what you're doing if my audience doesn't know you?
Well, you just gave my brief history, but when I was in high school, I had a desire to serve in physics as well as to do something before I was a pastor, and then served as a pastor for 30 years, and during that time got my PhD, and very much enjoyed the privilege of discipling men in the context of teaching, especially men who are headed for the ministry. Mm-hmm. And was given that opportunity at Bethlehem College and Seminary, which is in Minneapolis. When I moved up here to serve in a church, was able to do it adjunct until about the time I was 60. They offered me a job full-time there, and it seemed to be a good third career move and something, Lord willing, sustainable for the next couple of decades.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's get into the subject. First off, do you affirm the virgin birth, which I do affirm?
Yes, I do, Nick. What I found, though, is sometimes the discussion stops after only affirming or not affirming, or it becomes merely an argument over whether or not it should be affirmed.
So what got you interested in the virgin birth of all things?
Well, a number of articles that I read, but also in conversations with my students, seeing just that issue, that when we talked about the nature of Christ as God and man, one of the subjects was, of course, talking about his virgin birth. Mm-hmm. But what it meant beyond affirming it was not so clear to my students, and I realized it wasn't so clear to me either. Mm-hmm. So I began to think about it over the next 5 or 6 years. Mm-hmm. And as I thought, I collected ideas, things I read, things other men, friends had taught me. And at first I thought it was going to be an article, and ultimately it was a book.
Now, the virgin birth today is often seen as a sort of shibboleth, as it were. For those who don't know, this is a biblical reference that when Jephthah had defeated some of his enemies, and I believe it was the tribe of Ephraim, wasn't happy that they weren't included in the battle. They decided to go to war with them, And there need to be a way to recognize the Ephraimites and the non-Ephraimites. And one of them was they had a hard time pronouncing the word shibboleth. So a shibboleth seems to be kind of like a dividing line, as it were. And the virgin birth is usually just like that, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you're right. There is a sense that it defines whether or not you're in or out in regard to evangelical fundamental beliefs and whether or not you are part of that.
Mm-hmm. Because usually it seems, for instance, with Christians, where if you don't hold the virgin birth, by God, you must be a liberal in sorts. And for skeptics, if you hold the virgin birth, well, geez, you must be incredulous and ignorant of science.
That does seem to be the divide, though it is new, as perhaps you already know, Nick. It's new as of the 19th century, when the Enlightenment began to mature, probably starting with Schleiermacher, but then others who picked up on that and made science in some way a decider over top the scriptures. And that meant a kind of limitation on what was legitimate to believe if we were going to live in what they consider to be a modern world.
Yeah, I believe it's even Rudolf Bultmann who said, for instance, that no one can live in the age of electronic lights and radio and such and affirm the miracles of the New Testament.
Yeah, that was exactly the feeling that began in the 19th century. That's correct.
Well, your book here, I read through. It's an excellent book, and we're going to spend some time a little bit here talking about one subject that's not discussed too much, but it is discussed some. Since this is an apologetics podcast, we're going to be talking a bit about the historicity of a virgin birth, as it were. Now, how should we start off conversations when we meet someone who's very skeptical of a virgin birth?
Well, I think, again, that the issue is making the same claim the Bible does, and in sense, allowing that claim to stand. Our job not to prove that the Bible is true. Our job is to let the Bible loose, because we see the word as powerful. We see the word as a sword. So often when we reduce it to an argument, which isn't what you suggested, but I've seen a number of people do that, Nick. When we reduce it to an argument, it becomes our ability to battle. We almost muffle the word rather than letting it stand.
Mm-hmm. But there are some people who do still have questions. I mean, let's start with a common one you see on the internet, for instance, that there are so many pagan accounts of virgin births, and where Jesus is just a rip-off of that one, obviously.
Yeah, for some, that's an obvious thing. More interesting to me is why there are so many. For example, the flood accounts, which is another similar kind of discussion that seems outside of our normal experience. But most cultures have a flood account. So one of the charges brought against Scripture is we made one up too. Or a creation account. Many have a creation account that at least sounds mythological. And the accusation is made against Christians that we, if you will, try to fit in. The reality is that on God and on his word, for he says he's original, he's the first, he's the one who's defining. It seems to make more sense to understand that the virgin birth account, the flood account, the creation account, that the Bible has are foundational, whereas the others are dim echoes. The difficulty in that, perhaps, is that the flood and the creation are prior to written history, whereas the virgin birth account seems to come after some of the others have been put forward. Interestingly, it's not necessarily the case that the virgin birth story wasn't anticipated. E.W. Bullinger, early in the 19th century, was one who suggested that God had told to Adam that the virgin birth would be the event that would bring about the first invasion of redemption into creation. Now, he didn't prove his case, but he suggests something very interesting, and that could be the root of some of these virgin birth stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say as one who's looked into many of them are actually not virgin birth stories at all. But one of my favorites to use as the example of the deity Mithras and say, well, I suppose technically you could say Mithras is a virgin birth. That rock quite probably never did have sex with anyone.
Well said.
Mm-hmm. Now, some people also can say, but there are also so many contradictions in the narratives of Matthew and Luke, which are the only ones that explicitly talk about the virgin birth. What are we supposed to do with those?
Well, maybe you could make this more specific. So give me a sample of what you would see or what you've been charged with as a difference in these stories. Of course, one is from the perspective of Mary and one is from the perspective of Joseph.
Mm-hmm. Well, Matthew has things taking place in Bethlehem apparently quite naturally. Luke has to make up this whole worldwide census, supposedly, and get them there just in order to fulfill prophecy. And then there's the time differences and such. Luke has been back in Jerusalem about 8 days later for the circumcision and such, and the Magi show up in Bethlehem, and it's quite likely maybe a year or so later when they do.
Yeah, I think it is possible that the stories are both incomplete and therefore both giving, if you will, different perspectives that sound distinct. For example, when Jesus went over to Decapolis, were there two demoniacs or one? Mm-hmm. We have the representation of one, which isn't incompatible with there being two, and we have the representation of two that seems to be incongruous at first. Mm-hmm. We've got other examples of Jesus feeding 5,000 and 4,000, and if the accounts weren't both in the same gospel, one was in grass, one was in desert, we'd be saying those are really different stories. And the fact they are, in that case, it's different accounts of different stories. Mm-hmm. We've got John representing a clearing of the temple early in his gospel, whereas all the others do it at the end. So there's a lot of questions about what is the author representing by selecting the facts he does. By leaving out facts, he may be leading us to an incomplete story, but that doesn't seem to bother them. Their job doesn't seem to be to give a complete history, but by the truth that they do reveal to us, help us see a particular point. So I don't see those as any reason to see a distinction. I think the easiest or most challenging distinction is the difference in the genealogies, for example, that are given in the two accounts.
Yeah, we'll get to that later on the show here. But what about the Lucan census, for instance? Do you have any opinions on the census in Luke?
I don't have any opinions on the difference in regard to the census. That's not something that I have studied enough to have a valid opinion. But I can say in regard to the Magi and the visitors, I don't think there's a compelling reason to assume, as we do, that just because of how long it took between when they saw the sign in the heavens, how long ago that happened and how long it took for them to come, or the fact that Herod destroyed everybody under 2, one could easily conceive that God sent them there to have them arrive just at the time of the birth, and that Herod, being Herod, was glad to kill everybody under the age of 2 just so he didn't miss anybody. Mm-hmm. Adding up the numbers, that probably amounts to about 20 babies. So he's saying, I'm not going to kill 2, I'm going to kill everybody that I can account for. And even so, likelihood, given the numbers that we understand at that time, that would have been somewhere in the order of 20 rather than 200. And so he was just it's conceivable that he was just being thorough. We don't know that they showed up 2 years late.
Yeah. And a lot of skeptics do ask, well, geez, why isn't this slaughter of the infants mentioned by Josephus and such? And I would say, well, Josephus isn't necessarily giving us an exhaustive account of everything Herod did, and this
Right.
could have really been a minor incident in Herod's career, par for the course for him.
It certainly is fitting to the kinds of things he did throughout his career. And if I'm right, and I may not be, but if I'm right that this accounts for about 20 babies, that's awful in terms of 20 families being involved, but certainly doesn't hit the kinds of massacres that we hear about of Herod and of Herod's massacres planned and not completed, as well as others throughout history. That sounds a little bit small unless Jesus is at the center of it, and that makes it's significant to each of the families, of course, but on the scale of worldwide massacres, it may be rather small.
It does seem to be an interesting phenomenon. I know in biblical studies that an account in the Bible can't be seen as true unless it's explicitly mentioned somewhere else, but that never seems to work with any other field out
That's
area. Right. It's quite amazing to me.
Yeah, that's right. History isn't always fully attested across different authors, for they have different intentions and perspectives, and they have different things that they're preserving. And actually, 10 people might have preserved it, and only the biblical accounts made it to us. We might still yet find them.
Yeah. Now, there's also a fact that, for instance, let's look at the other Gospels. Mark and John nowhere explicitly say anything about a virgin birth. Wouldn't this be an important detail for them to include?
Well, I'm not convinced they didn't. There's an explicit account and implicit accounts. I'm remembering that both Mark and John start at different places. John starts paralleling the creation story. Mark starts with the declaration of the gospel and the work of the Baptist. And so their starting point is different. John, it seems, does actually implicitly refer to the virgin birth in chapter 1, verses 12 and 13. And so in that context, he talks about our virgin birth, if you will, by the Spirit, which is a teaching that Jesus himself will pick up again in chapter 3. So like a good prelude, John is preparing us for what's coming. But in those two verses, maybe it's worth me reading them, he says, "But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God." And then verse 14, the famous, "And the word became flesh." What's interesting is 13, "who were born not of blood," is translated by Tertullian and Irenaeus as "he was born." And so when they report this text in the context of their own writings, they change it to "he." Now, there's no textual evidence for this, but it's interesting that for these two early church writers, they saw this as a reference to Jesus and to his his birth as from a virgin. That is, not by man's effort, designs, genealogy, but a virgin conception and birth. So does that mean that that's exactly what John meant? Not necessarily, but here's two men fairly close to John who hear that echo implicitly here in the Gospel of John. And I'm inclined to think that that was in John's mind, though that would be hard to prove. Mark similarly has references to Jesus being a child of Mary in chapter 3. And without reference to Joseph, yes, perhaps he died. But also that seems to be how he's known. And so Mark seems to be giving us an echo. It doesn't say son of Joseph, who, though he was dead, would still be a right attribution. So when in 3 he talks about, son of Mary, that may be Mark's implicit signing on to the virgin birth. So you're right, only 2 of them was that their intent to spend a significant amount of time on it. But seems to me John and Mark are tipping their hat to the reality.
Yeah. I'd like to add a little bit to that. For what you've said about John, I know Spiros Zodhiates said the exact same thing in his book, Was Christ God? That's the first time I'd ever read that kind of interpretation. And then I read it in your book again. Thought, well, maybe there is a lot more to this than I thought. And for Mark is supposed to be the eyewitness testimony of Peter. And for more on that, listeners, we've interviewed Richard Balcom on the show on his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. So I recommend going back and listening back if you want more information on that. But if this is the eyewitness account of Peter, well, Peter quite likely was not present for the virgin birth. So we can understand it being left out.
True enough.
Now, what about Paul, though? Because some people think, shouldn't Paul have talked about this in his epistles? But yet, Paul doesn't have any explicit statements either.
No, he doesn't, and that's often shown as a reason to have some concern. I don't think that's obvious either. Again, short-circuiting that same discussion, every author has a point to make. The gospel narrative are fundamentally focused on the life of Christ. Paul is focused on the meaning of the life of Christ, and so we might let him off the hook on that account alone. But there's actually more, because Paul, throughout his writings, refers to this odd thing called adoption. We won't find that in Jewish history as a legitimate or good thing, and yet somehow, some way, for Paul, adoption has become something that he trumpets and holds up as something that should encourage us in Romans 8 and in Ephesians and in Galatians. And so this idea seems to be, I would say, Paul's reflection of the virgin birth, talking about what is the meaning of the virgin birth. So not looking at Christ's life, but at the meaning. He seems to take that, and as you and I have discussed by letter, the adoption of Christ by Joseph is a radical new thing, to call it a good thing and to call it something that people are feeling encouraged and excited about. It seems that Jesus gave a new meaning to adoption that Paul picked up and gave that label to us.
And I think you also include a reference in your book to Galatians 4 about that the interesting passage says, born of woman, to which Moses could say, well, Jesus and everybody?
Right. And so Paul, I'm just looking at my Bible here, and that's circled in 4:4. Paul, really at that point, we would have expected him to say something else, born of but he doesn't. He really does step aside, and it does, again, seem to be his agreement with what his audience already knows. Mm-hmm. So there's many things Paul doesn't repeat, many things Paul doesn't lay foundation, but it's a very odd phrase given Paul's typical phraseology if he's not signing on to what is common currency among the church. Mm-hmm. And probably even before some of the Gospels at least have been written and circulated.
And let's also say that were this not the case, this is really something that, contrary to what people might think, the early church would not really want to make up, because it would seem too much like a pagan doctrine. I mean, Matthew is hardly going to win favors with a Jewish audience. He says, Jesus, illegitimate? No. It was Yahweh who did it. I mean, most skeptics look and say, okay, so Mary was raped or had an affair, or Joseph just couldn't wait, and you're blaming it on Yahweh. Yeah, that's convincing.
Yeah, it just is. Joseph in Matthew is so grieved and offended when Mary gives this explanation that she is with child by the Holy Spirit, and like what we would call a good modern, not a pre-modern, what we imagine to be a pre-modern, he should have been gullible and said, sure, of course, but he didn't. He made plans to divorce her, though quietly, kindly, gently, nonetheless to divorce her in his grief. Pre-moderns didn't find this something attractive. This is a problem for the gospel, and they were dealing with the real history. God is invading. He's making demands, and it wasn't easy then. It wasn't any easier then for pre-moderns than for moderns or postmoderns.
Yeah, I find it amusing when some people argue against this with me and say, well, we know so much more about science than they did. I said, look, Joseph and Mary probably did not know as much about embryology and gestation and such as we did. So, but they certainly knew enough to know what it takes to make a baby. If you think this is something new, then please tell me, when exactly was it that science established that it takes sex between a man and a woman to make a baby?
Yes, well said.
Let's start looking into the reasons for the virgin birth, because it could be something to think this is kind of like God showing off or something, but really that's not the case. What are the two big reasons that you argue against first in your church? I'd like to just hear you explain them.
Well, sure. Early on in the church, there was an anxiety, if you will, about sexual relationships, mostly for the same reason there is today. It's very hard for us to get that right. It's a very powerful thing, something that's easy for us to mishandle. And so there was an anxiety, if you will, about the stain of concupiscence. Now, concupiscence comes from two Latin roots, one meaning with, the other meaning lust. Lust isn't always just sexual lust, but it did mean lust, an illegitimate passion, a twisted passion for something. And so with twisted passion or with sexual lust, and it was their opinion that only in the imagination could a husband and wife in perfect holiness conceive of a child, that in some way there was always what they called concupiscence mixed in. Augustine was one of many, but he was a leading voice, who saw this as a problem for the birth of Christ. And although he wasn't wholly clear in this, and it became a fixture later in the church, but he wanted some way to remove this stain from the coming of the birth of Christ.
If I could jump in right quick, what you're saying
Sure.
then is there was this concern that even between a married husband and wife, that
Exactly.
having sex would be wrong in some ways because it wasn't done out of a desire to have children, but out of a desire to have sex.
Yeah, only in a perfect world. In other words, our motives are never pure. That would be their argument. No matter what you do or in this world, our motives are never pure. And for the coming of the Holy One, there was a desire to say, well, then maybe this gets rid of the pure motives problem. As if it was wrong to enjoy your spouse sexually, as if sexually enjoying your spouse was even wrong for married couples. That's right.
So right now, I'm guessing there could be some married husbands out there on the edge of their seat saying, "Where is it wrong? Please say it's not wrong, please."
Well, I think there's many places in Scripture we could go to be convinced of that, not least would be Song of Solomon, but not the only. No, I think there was a misunderstanding that was not singular to that day and time. And I think it continues even today. I think Paul dealt with it in 1 Corinthians 7, where there were some people coming to the church saying, Christians should not marry. He said, well, I'll give you a reason not to marry. Reason not to marry would be just to be focused on the front lines work of the kingdom, but marriage itself is not a problem. This is not something that Christians should be listening to. And I think that probably was an argument along the same lines and the kind of argument that is really a distraction for what it means for Christians to be not only not under the law, but set free because of the blood of Christ. But even before that time, it was true.
And even in that passage, he has this statement where he says, when you have a married couple, they should not abstain from sex except for a short time and by mutual consent, which it's pretty much saying, Yeah, married couples, you all need to be having sex together. And we can be quite sure there were some couples in Paul's churches who were above childbearing years, and he'd still be saying, yeah, you need to be having sex together.
Yeah, I think that covers that well, Nick. That's right.
Mm.
And then the other misguided reason was a concern about original sin, and this isn't one of the problems with saying the virgin birth solves the problem of original sin. Is you have to believe that sin is passed down through the husband only. Now, that would be a very strange, not biblically supported position. There's no reason to think that men versus women are particularly evil or particularly passed down evil. If that's true, there's just no evidence to that effect. So even this issue, that is, even if original sin is passed through conception, it wouldn't be solved by having just one, that is just the woman.
Mm-hmm.
For he's still related to her.
Yeah. So now we've dealt with two ideas, and these were ideas that some people might be thinking these were a bit bizarre, but they were seriously debated in the early church and even medieval period, weren't they?
Well, not only that, but I think they're the common coin today. I think it's the first answer that people tend to give when pressed for a reason. That still comes to mind. We still have that kind of idea that there must be something wrong with sex, that original sin, well, maybe it does pass through genetically. So I don't think it's only then. I think we're still the inheritors of that.
Yeah, and just for those who might be concerned, this in no way denies that there is such a thing as original sin.
Right, and it doesn't deny that there's concupiscence.
Yeah.
It just denies that concupiscence is a necessary sin for married couples. And it doesn't deny original sin. It just says, I don't think the Bible has told us exactly how that's passed on.
Yeah, I don't even think I'd say necessary sin, as it were, because I really don't think it's any sin for me to look at my wife and desire her and such.
Well, no, my point was that it is, of course, possible to do to act with lust,
Yeah.
and rather that's just a reality for us. That it's a reality that it's gone in the context of marriage. Sure, that's where it's permitted, but the concupiscence continues. Though the argument that it's not continuing within marriage is a good one.
Yeah. Now, if those aren't the reasons why God would give us a virgin birth to give us Christ, where it's good to knock down the false reasons, but we need something to put in its place. What do you have to put in its place?
Well, I think there's about 6 that have come to mind, but before we even talk about those, Nick, let me give the caveat that my book is intended as 6 offered ideas in the hope that people reading it say, and we've got 60 more. So it isn't these 6. And in fact, some of those that I propose may not have standing in the end. I hope they do. I think they do. But I'm not as concerned with defending each of these 6 as making people or helping people to begin to think of others and to move away from the shibboleth to the rich meaning and how we're supposed to live out this drama as Christians. So glad to talk about those 6, but just want to make it clear that I don't think defending these is my main. Certainly not trying to limit this to 6.
Yeah. So as we're getting into these, some people might listen to some and say, that one doesn't really work for me and such. And so I think, well, I thought of one that I think you haven't considered, and you'd be thrilled with both of those.
Yeah, I'd be very glad for pushback in any of them, though I'd probably have to unfriend them in Facebook. But
Hey, so let's go into them. I mean, I've got your book right here with me, and we got a chapter here on historic and biblically grounded meanings and such. So, what are one of the reasons I see in here is to stand against the bias of naturalism.
Okay.
So let's discuss that one a little bit.
Well, my background is in physics, though to be clear, I was an engineering physicist, as you read my docket. That I have a bachelor's in physics. I got to do a lot of things at Fermilab that were punching above my weight, but was not a scientist or a physicist, which would have required a PhD. But I loved working there. I loved the privilege of serving with men and women who were looking deeply as exegetes of God's natural revelation, his general revelation. And I think there's much to learn from that. There does tend to be a bias out of the Enlightenment and out of the science only perspective that at least we're told is our inheritance in our culture. And the idea here is that the universe is all there is, all there was, and all there ever will be.
Thank you, Dr. Sagan.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's where that comes from. And the more technical term would be that this is a ontological naturalism. That is, the naturalism, it really defines what being is. Well, of course, the Bible in its opening words says completely differently. In the beginning, God, and then God spoke, and the universe was, so we have our being from God. So that's a significant divide. But interestingly, the divide isn't fundamentally between ontological naturalism and theism. The fundamental divide is over means to understand creation on creation's terms. And that's a project which is worth doing. That is, understanding creation in creation's terms. But into the middle of that, if someone wants to say science necessarily has a ontological naturalism or an ontological materialism component, which I think, again, is speaking outside anything. Science doesn't even have the right to say that, because all science is saying is, how does it work? And so the coming of Christ into this world, we're given a sign. And this sign that God gives to us is that a woman who has never had sexual relationship bears a child. And God says, deal with that. And there is a graciousness, a condescension of God to invade the world and say, I'm going to force you to deal with me as I am and as I present myself. So that's one thing the virgin birth is doing, is it is a sign and a symbol which points to God. Now, someone could still choose not to believe it, of course, but it still is that lightning rod that makes us decide which side of the divide, which isn't science versus not science. It's ontological materialism versus a world in which there is someone outside of the universe, and that someone being specifically the creator and redeemer of the world.
Yeah, the debate really isn't so much about science, it's much more about philosophy and metaphysics instead.
Yeah, one of the best books I've read in this is by Alvin Plantinga, Where the Conflict Really Lies, a book I'd strongly recommend.
Same here. I've tried to get him on the show before. I haven't had any luck so far, but who knows what the future holds here. And for anyone also interested in these issues, we've done several shows on science and religion. Hugh Ross has been on a number of times. Then from the theistic creationist side, we've had people from BioLogos on as well. So I recommend going back and checking those archives and looking at those shows. Now, there was also the reason that the virgin birth was simply given to protect the full deity and the full humanity of Jesus.
Yes, that's very significant in that when we come into the world, and rather we come with Christian parents who are teaching us about Jesus from the beginning, or we find ourselves confronted by someone who wants to present to us the Bible and the God behind the Bible, our experience is to meet Jesus as God. That's how we first learn about him, and it grows in us that he's fully human. Interestingly, the apostles had the reverse experience. They met Jesus as fully human, and it grew on them he told them, but it took a while to sink in, that he was fully divine. And the virgin birth is one of those events that helps us see that when God comes to the world in the person of Jesus Christ, he comes to the world in a way that declares in really absolute terms, on his terms, I am both God and man, not half and half, but fully both, because a virgin is with child by the Holy Spirit. And so Karl Barth said, the dogma of the virgin birth is thus the confession which eliminates the last surviving possibility of understanding the very God and very man intellectually as an idea or arbitrary interpretation in the sense of, and I'm going to use two terms, docetic or Ebionite Christianity, close quote. But what he's saying here is the world is always trying to pick between a docetic view, he's really God, not really man, or an Ebionite view, he's just a man who we should follow and pay attention to, not really God. And so those two pictures have often divided the church. And Barth is saying that the virgin birth jumps on us and says, no, listen, look at me. I'm claiming both. You cannot resolve this into one side or the other.
Yeah, and both of those groups would have absolutely denied the virgin birth as well. I think the Ebionites did specifically.
Mm-hmm. They would have to. It just wouldn't fit into their system. And in fact, God likes to do things that don't fit into our system. He specializes in that.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important because usually we can make this some sort of doctrine, say, about Mary or something like that. But really, virgin birth isn't a doctrine at all about Mary. I mean, Mary's a special woman, but if it had been Mary, it would have been another woman. But it's a doctrine about Jesus entirely.
Yeah, it's both a creation and a redemption doctrine. That's always going to involve God's people, but it's first about God. The whole Bible is first about God. And it together, the virgin birth, hits both the great truths of it hits really all three, creation, redemption, and revelation all at once.
Mm-hmm. Now, we talked a little bit about the genealogies and such, and this is an important topic, but in order to discuss the topics of the genealogies, I think we need to go back in biblical time about, say, 600 years or so before the virgin birth. Now, someone could be saying, 600 years before the virgin birth, why do we need to go back all that far to understand the genealogies? What happened that was so important?
Did you want to take that, or you want me to handle that?
I was wanting you to handle that.
I will. All right. Well, Jeremiah was a prophet in Josiah's day. He got an easy start. Josiah was a man seeking after God. But things went downhill for Jeremiah after that. His job got harder. And in that context, along comes a king named Jehoiakim with an M, and then his son Jehoiakim. They had so grieved God, Jehoiakim through his longish reign of 11 years, Jehoiakim in his brief reign of 3 months, that God said to both of them in Jeremiah 22 and then later, oddly, in 36 to the Father. Jeremiah is not a book that is slavishly committed to a linearity of story. And he says in Jeremiah 22 to Jehoiakim, God has cursed you. He calls him Conaniah, one of his names. God has cursed you because of your behavior, and no child born to you will ever reign. And in cursing both Jehoiakim and his royal son, Jehoiakim, he has, that is, God has, through Jeremiah, cut off the line of Christ, something he had promised. And this had to grieve both Jeremiah as well as the people. And what was interesting is Jehoiakim Jehoiakim was not killed. He was taken off to Babylon. He's alive. And so along comes a man named Hananiah, chapter 28 of Jeremiah. And Hananiah is a false prophet, but we can understand this false prophet. He says to the people of Israel, hey, I'm telling you, within a very short period of time, God is going to restore everything. He's going to give you your king back, which he didn't say his name, but it means that he's going to send back Jehoiakim. They knew he was still alive. He's going to prosper you, and all will be well. Jeremiah responds basically with, let it be so, but mockingly. And they got into a really deep disagreement, which on the face of it, Jeremiah lost. But Jeremiah said, if I'm God's prophet, you will die before your prophecy could ever come to pass, and it won't. And that's what happened. Hananiah died. Jehoiakim was not returned. But Jeremiah took an interesting turn. He also says 3 times, as sure as the day is followed by the night, and night by day. He calls it God's covenant with the day. So God will bring the reign of David. Now, these two seem absolutely impossible to reconcile, and Jeremiah gives no clue how that's going to happen. And yet, God will do so. There will be a ruler. And, of course, we have to wait 600 years to find out how he does that.
Now, that's also say that some scholars and such do take the interpretation that when the king is to be rendered childless, it doesn't mean for all time. It just means none of his immediate descendants.
Yeah, that is one way to understand it. I think that understanding is driven not by the text immediately, but by the outcome. Mm-hmm. And so looking at the outcome, if the text alone stood as a text, I think we would, without discussion, say, well, of course. But I think these scholars are looking at the end. They've read the end. And so there has to be some way to reconcile. And so a way is to do, as mentioned, to say this is just a single generation. But no child born to you will reign. Typically, that kind of language covers everything to come. And interestingly, it is his children who are followed in the royal succession given in, as you've already anticipated, but given in the genealogy that we have in Matthew. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to see that Shealtiel, who is an immediate descendant of Jehoiakim and Jehoiakim, show up. But, of course, he doesn't rule, does he? But there's a man, namely Joseph, who's descended from him. How's that going to work? That's the question. And they do show up. His children are in this lineage. Why?
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating to hear all this talk, because if most of us read through Jeremiah, we seem like isolated instances and isolated prophecies, and we don't really realize the magnitude of what's being said. I mean, heck, I hadn't connected Hananiah and all this together until I read the book. Now, that is a viewpoint I had not considered before.
Yeah, I think it is easy to read on the surface in the sense that we take every story disconnected from every other story. But the Bible is really telling a whole story that connects more than just the seemingly disparate stories in Jeremiah, and it is a little bit jumbled, but actually putting it together with the biggest picture, the canonical story. And yeah, that takes a lot of attending, but don't feel bad, Nick. I think it's going to take us all of eternity to figure it out. Just, I think we'll have all of heaven just keep saying, oh, I see more. I see more.
Now, and one aspect of a text I didn't see you talk about, though, is that when the prophecy is given in Jeremiah 22, I believe it speaks about a signet ring and such. But when Zerubbabel returns in the book of Haggai, he's referred to as God's signet ring. And I've sometimes considered, could this be a reverser of the prophecy in Jeremiah.
Yeah, it really could be, and I don't want to assert that's not possible. I I do give a kind of priority to Jeremiah's message. This won't happen. I do give a kind of priority to what's going on at the birth of Christ. I see that and believe that God is basically saying, "Look, I've got this," rather than a restoration against the prophecy, which is possible. God often has all of God's curses are going to be reversed, all of them. But I think this was, as you saw in the book, this was at least intended to confuse the enemy. In other words, Satan doesn't have access to everything God knows, or he'd be God. Satan has access to what God's people know. So, for example, First Peter says, even the angels long to look into these things, talking about the prophecies that anticipate the coming of Christ in 1:8 through 10, I think it is. And so Satan, like the angels, is at least that limited. And so he listens to what God's people know. And when God's people are confused, he's necessarily confused. He's got the word, but he doesn't have the spirit to read it by. And so he just has to listen to the debates as we go on trying to make sense out of it. And people, I think, did not know where this Messiah would come from. We get some hint of that from Revelation 12, where Satan is just looking for where is this birth going to come from? I must undo it. But of course, he doesn't. He can't. He doesn't have enough information. So it's possible that part of the reason for this is not just to confuse us, but to hide information from the enemy, which seems to be an ongoing story. Eve, for example, after she had her first baby, talks about, this is the seed that was promised in Genesis 3:15. And what do we see next? Well, Satan tries to murder that seed, but as an answer. And he murders the younger seed, and he corrupts the older seed. But God actually gives a seed through Seth. And so Satan is just doing his evil best to undermine. And whenever the story, if you will, goes underground, it makes it more difficult for Satan, at least, whatever other reasons.
Okay, since some people here haven't read the book, I'm sure I dare say most of them here probably haven't yet. Could you expand on this theory you got about the devil and what happened here?
As far as hiding information from the enemy?
Yes.
Well, if God says to Jeremiah, through Jeremiah, that the line of David is cut off, it's effectively what Jeremiah 22 and 36 are saying, and yet says within Jeremiah 3 other times, but I won't abandon David, that's really confusing information. And if it's true that, sure, Shealtiel can come back as a governor, but he cannot reign. He cannot be a king like his fathers were, and none of his descendants can be that king, as I would read it, signet ring or not. Then it makes it very difficult for Satan to know how to oppose this coming king, how to oppose this coming birth of the seed that threatens to crush his head. And he is active and at work, according to Revelation 12, trying to destroy that king even at his birth. But by hiding that information, by saying, I've seemed to have cut down the tree. Interestingly, we have throughout the prophets references to Jesus as the shoot, the root, as if it had been cut off, a branch growing from that root. This idea of the tree has been chopped down, but God is going to do something from that tree which shocks us. And Jesus is going to come from what looked like it was dead. And if he's doing that, it is at least, whatever else it is, confusing to the enemy. It's certainly confusing to us, too, who are trying to say, well, then how are you going to do this? How will David actually reign? And so my proposal is that 600 years later, when the virgin birth comes along, that what God is doing is saying, look, he's come through Mary. Now, I don't know what Mary's genealogy is, and I spend a lot of time talking about the possibilities in the book. At this point, let's just agree that Joseph is clearly said to be descended from David and Solomon and Shealtiel, which makes him related to the royal line. But if I'm right in my reading of Jeremiah, he's not able to rule. But Jesus, who is not his son, can be adopted in and given the right to rule. And so in this way, God sanctifies adoption, something that the Romans gave them. They didn't have Jewish tradition, but he came exactly at the right time. That's stressed throughout Scripture. And Satan was trumped because he didn't know enough to prevent it. And it's happening in Galilee, if you will, off camera. Where you talked about before, how did he get to Bethlehem? Well, we get that story in one of the Gospels, but he shows up in Bethlehem, but we know he's a Galilean. He's being brought to earth off camera, brought to earth by a woman only, and not directly related to the royal line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I gotta say, I thought it was interesting theory. I'm not, totally convinced, but you said, hey, that's okay and such, but it is something worth considering, I think. That's what I mean.
That's all I'm proposing.
And I think some of the early church fathers even said the same thing about the pagan doctrines and such, that this was kind of a diabolical mimicry, as it were, of trying to say, well, here's what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So now we get to those genealogies, and we ask, why are they so different, especially if they're the same person?
Yeah, that's right. It is confusing. I don't have a definitive answer. The scholars, by and large, suggest that both are distinct genealogies of Joseph, perhaps coming in and out of that royal line. For example, Luke is not initially coming through the royal line, but through Nathan, probably one of the sons of David. It could have skipped a couple of generations, but Nathan is not Solomon. I mean, that's a for sure thing. Nathan is not one of the kings, so this is a non-royal line. But by the time we get down to Shealtiel, somebody's married back in, right? And now it has re-entered the royal line that, at least on my understanding, was cut off by Jehoiakim. So there's distinct rooted identities, and that is prior to David, they are, for all intents and purposes, identical. Post David, they're distinct, but they come back around to the royal line. Some have suggested that Mary's genealogy might be given and through the Gospel of Luke, because that follows her story, whereas Matthew follows the story from Joseph's perspective, and so giving his genealogy, which is the royal one. That might be. Most scholars reject that. I find it attractive, but I'm not sure I have enough information to give a definitive view that has any weight. But I do find that it's an attractive possibility, which would allow Paul to say of Jesus, as do others, descended from David. And so if Mary was a non-royal relative, Jesus married into the royal line, but rooted back through Abraham, that would allow him to be a descendant of David, and yet not of the royal line, but coming through Nathan. Is that the case? I don't know. I do know he's related to David, because that's what Paul tells us. And I do know that those two genealogies are there for a purpose, and I suspect it goes beyond what I've discovered yet.
I think, if I'm remembering correctly, the early church had about 5 or 6 different interpretations of what was going on in these passages.
Right. People have been trying to understand where God's going with that since the beginning. I love the fact that the Bible does not make things easy for us. In other words, the Bible isn't giving us a story that is just an easy story to hear. It's always challenging us, and God doesn't do our work for us. He says, come close, listen to me, learn from me, but he makes us do work.
Well, I'd like to remind everyone that you're listening to Deeper Waters podcast, and I'm here with Dr. Richard Shenk this week, and we're talking about his book, The Virgin Birth of Christ, which I do affirm. But if you're here next week, we're still going to be talking about, Mary this time. And I have Tim Perry here with me. He's written the book, Mary for Evangelicals. After all, sometimes we seem to shy away from Mary when we see what Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox never say. Could that just as much be a mistake? How should evangelicals view Mary? Well, you'll be here. Next week, hopefully, Tim will be on, able to talk about it. We've tried to get him on twice. There's been events happening at his church that have kept him coming on, but we're really hopeful this time it's going to be different. But for now, let's get back to Dr. Shenk talking about his book, The Virgin Birth of Christ. And you also rely a lot on the work of J. Gresham Machen, I believe it was, in workers. Mm-hmm. When he started filing some of the opening shots against liberalism, one of the first doctrines he went through apparently is a virgin birth, right?
Yeah. Again, that became a dividing point since David Friedrich Strauss wrote The Life of Jesus. Mm-hmm. And in a number of ways, Machen was responding to not only to him in particular, but to those who followed him, to those who said, yeah, that makes sense. I just like this virgin birth idea. And it was then, not before, that the virgin birth became this interesting fault line, because people wanted to be able, by that time, people wanted to be able to have a world that did not need God. And one of the wonderful things about the virgin birth is it is this kind of divider that says, this is my Father's world. And God enters into it any way he pleases, whenever he wants.
Now, one of the things you mentioned about Jeconiah and such, that's a pretty important thing, is the idea of adoption being so special here. And we're going to get back to chapter 5 in your book some here, but since you brought up adoption, I would like to say, because Jews didn't really, if you look at Old Testament law, I don't think there's really much about adoption, if anything, in there.
No, not in the law. There's a few stories, Moses being adopted, of course, by Pharaoh's daughter. Mm-hmm. And we have the story of Abraham not wanting to be stuck with, if you will, mm-hmm. The adoption, which would have meant adopting one of his lead servants. He wanted his own son. And other than those, there's stories, there's no laws that come into place. And there wasn't a custom of adoption among the Jews, even apart from that. There wasn't a favorable picture of adoption. It was an act of, at best, desperation, and at worst, a tragedy.
Why would that be the case?
Well, I don't know why that would be the case, other than just that reality that the other story, if you will, going through the scripture, is this responsibility, this opportunity that women have to be the bearers of children. And in that, those who are related to Mary will come the one who is the seed, with the article. And so to participate in that is the greater thing. Adoption means not participating in that. Maybe that would seem to be fitting to the story. I don't have a clear answer, because it's only that it isn't there. It's only that it's looked at negatively. But it is interesting that it's in the day of Jesus that changes.
It could also be, one of my favorite areas to study is the idea of honor and shame in the biblical culture. And it was something considered shameful if a family couldn't have children, especially sons, and adoption could be seen as just saying, yeah, we've already admitted this isn't going to happen to us, because if that wasn't happening to you, it's like, well, God must be opposed to you somehow.
Yeah, I think that has some truth to it. I think you're putting your finger on that, Nick.
Mm-hmm. You did say that there was a system set up, and that was the Roman system, and it seemed to work pretty well. Even one child who was adopted in the Roman system went on to be emperor.
Yeah, the adoption was a good thing in the context of Rome, and God raised up Rome at least as a world system within or less than 100 years of Christ's coming. Of course, they had a presence before then, but they are beginning to dominate the Greek culture in the century leading up to Christ's birth, bringing their customs even into Israel.
And that can be tied into the whole theme in Galatians that we see at the appointed time, and such that
Right.
everything was set in place. You had world with one language, universal culture, pretty much, easy access to traveling around, things of that sort. That the world was essentially ripe for Christianity, as it were.
And even including, this was the day of crucifixion. Mm-hmm. And God had already set it up that Moses set it up, he who dies on a tree is cursed. Mm-hmm. And so this, all the pieces are coming together. Every piece that came together was God's puzzle that he laid almost like a mosaic.
Mm-hmm. And we can say it's had its effect, too, into adoption, because a lot of Christian couples out there are really adopting today and see it as a great thing. We got a couple at our church, they've got about 11 kids. I don't think many of them are natural. We just keep adopting more and more new kids and such. And meanwhile, you got the secularists out there who are aborting more and more kids.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I'm part of Bethlehem Baptist Church in Minneapolis, where John Piper was pastor for many years, and now Jason Meyer. And adoption has been a significant part of the culture in my church, and not disassociated from the rest of the evangelical church, but very much highlighted. And as you said, it is not a small matter that this is specifically at the time when the culture is aborting that we have such a high value in adopting. But I think one of the questions is why? Where would this come from? Because we don't see it in the Old Testament. And as you already hinted at, something changed. And although the Bible is not explicit in this, it's my opinion. I'm calling it opinion rather than a firm, but it's not my affirmation of belief, but it's my opinion that it was the adoption of Christ by Joseph that resulted in Paul's theology of adoption, and that was all dependent upon the reality of the virgin birth.
Mm-hmm. We tend to devote on the show Januaries to the topic of abortion, and I remember last year we had a guest on who said that really, if every church in America would adopt one child every season of the year, there would be no need of abortions anymore. We'd be providing for all the children. That's something that's always stuck with me.
Yeah, what grieves me is several of my friends are present on sidewalks around the abortion clinic that's nearest to our church, and only God can turn somebody's heart away who's set on divorce, the opportunity, or on abortion, the opportunity for adopting isn't enough. Satan has deluded us into thinking death is good and putting it at the center of our culture. So I agree. Wouldn't it be great if every church did that? Adding a capacity. I think we already have significant capacity for adopting more. God's going to have to change hearts and come against the culture of death.
And for any interested in this, I do recommend going and listening to some of our January shows on the topic of abortion. We've got many more planned coming up for next month and such.
Good.
And let's also talk about what you could refer to as the chiastic reversal. That could be a new word to some people. What exactly is a chiasm?
A chiasm is a term of art. It's used by biblical theologians and students of the Bible, often, not all students of the Bible, but it refers to a structure that looks like one of the Hebrew letters, the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet, I'm sorry, I misspoke, of the first letter in Christ's name in Greek. But the idea is that it builds into the center and works its way back out. And usually at the center of the argument then is the bright spot. So a lot of times for us, our argument builds A to B to C to D, and the last point is our key point. In a chiastic structure, the key point is center, and the points along the way usually parallel each other. So point A is parallel to the last point you make, and point B is parallel to the second to last point. But C is in the center, and that's the bright spot. And so a chiastic reversal means that when things have worked out very darkly, suddenly when you follow them in, you come to the bright spot, and then they unwind back from that, undoing all the grief that had happened along the way. And that's what I'm suggesting as a possibility in regard to the virgin birth for the role of Eve being reversed by the role of Mary.
Yeah, let's dig into that some, because when we read our Bibles, Eve seems to get a bum rap sometimes, and this is especially so when we get to 1 Timothy 2, I believe it is, because, it wasn't the man that was deceived. No, that man, he was innocent. That woman was the problem, and this is why some people think Paul was a sexist. At least one of the reasons, such because he put so much blame on Eve.
Yeah, they see him as a misogynist of some kind because, but they're really misreading it. The misreading is this, that what Paul says is it wasn't Adam who was deceived, but Eve. And the reason he says that is because when Eve was confronted by God in Genesis chapter 3, her first response is, the serpent deceived me, and I ate. And so what Paul is doing is he's just taking her words, putting them at her lips, and saying, you were deceived. The real point there is Adam wasn't deceived. Eyes wide open. After Eve had eaten of the fruit, whatever kind of fruit it was, she comes to him with this out of it. The question is, why did he eat it? Why would he eat it after he sees that missing bite? And Adam rebelled. That's the implicit statement that Paul's making. But since his issue there is Eve, he's just following her line. But this in no way exonerates Adam. In fact, were Paul at that point to be talking about Adam's sin, which he does in Romans chapter 5, it is on Adam that he hangs the most grievous sin, because he acted in knowledge, and he acted with eyes open and rebelled.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the rabbis had some amusing looks at this. Just recently, I read Kyle Greenwood's book he edited, Since the Beginning, looks in the history of Genesis 1 and 2, and we are working on booking him. He was supposed to come on, but we had a family crisis happen here, and we're working on getting him back on. But one of the most amusing ones I read as an interpretation of the account is some rabbis said, well, what had happened, or at least one of them says, what had happened was that Adam and Eve had just got done having sex, and Adam fell asleep as a result, and during that time, Eve was deceived, and she woke him up, and he was so tired and groggy, he didn't realize what he was doing until he took a bite from him. Oh my gosh, what did I just eat? Yeah, it's a bit amusing to hear these kinds of things.
Milton had another take, and in Paradise Lost, and I'm inclined to think it's a possible. The Bible isn't clear, but Milton's take was that having seen that fruit with the bite out of it, seeing Eve holding that, and he realizes in that moment he has to choose between this woman that God gave to him to solve the very problem that God pointed out in Adam's soul. He doesn't have a helper fit for him. Once he got that helper, he was not about to choose her over God. Or say it the other way, he didn't value God highly enough to choose God over her. And so on Milton, his choice was to rebel and say, I'm taking the gift, I'm taking this woman you created for me, and I'm rejecting you, God, which makes his sin all the worse.
Yeah, interesting when you look at the same way you were interpreting the passage. Paul isn't being soft on Adam. If anything, he could be being harder on Adam, because he said, Eve Eve made a mistake. She was deceived. We could say she didn't know better, but Adam, boy, you had no excuse whatsoever for doing that.
That's exactly right. Exactly right.
Now, the early church, this isn't entirely something new because the early church did have looks at Mary and Eve, and they did regularly compare the two of them together. I'm not sure if all the comparisons were entirely valid. For instance, they refer to Mary and Eve as both virgins. I'm not sure if the text gives us any indication that Eve was a virgin at that point. But the comparisons were going on.
It does give us an indication, though, that she was, because God tells them twice, go have kids. And it's only in chapter 4:1 it says Adam knew his wife Eve. It sounds like it's new news. It may not be, but because 4:1 opens with Adam knew his wife, there's some indication that the fall happened so quickly they hadn't gotten around to trying to make kids together.
I just find that a bit surprising, but it could be looking at it from a much more foreign perspective and such, which would think the couple doesn't really probably need much encouragement and such, but who knows?
That's why I think it didn't take long for the fall. It's just that argument.
Now, the passage does say some other things that really we can have a hard time understanding, such as saved by childbirth. What are we saying about a woman has to be married and have kids in order to be saved?
Well, that was one of the throwaway interpretations, isn't it? The argument here is in some ways very simple. Well, I spend a lot of time in the book trying to be very careful because the argument I'm going to make isn't at the center of the discussion about egalitarian versus complementarity. And I don't want to pretend that what I'm saying really enters into that discussion. But I do think it's important and worth seeing some of the key things about this, which may talk to exactly the issue of the virgin birth. And so in verse 13, it says Adam was formed first, then Eve. So whatever else Paul is going to say about egalitarianism or complementarity, he is making an historical argument, a theological argument that's grounded in Adam and Eve. And so we could say chapter 2 of 1 Timothy, verse 13, is about creation, and creation specifically of Adam and Eve. Verse 14, it continues with that historical argument. Adam was not deceived. You've already alluded to that. But the woman was deceived on her own words in Genesis 3 and became a transgressor. So 13 talks about creation, 14 talks about the fall. Now, if we continue in that line, if Paul is going to continue that line, we have every right to expect the next phrase, and since we have verses, the next verse, to follow that up. So we've got creation, we've got the fall. We would expect the next to be about redemption, and we're not surprised. Yet she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, holiness, with self-control. This is talking about redemption. There's the word sosa, which in Greek is Paul's very technical word. In fact, on my reading, and the reading of most scholars, he never uses that word apart from redemption. That is not just the kind of saving like you save green stamps or you save the whales. Paul is using this in a very technical redemptive sense, and of course that follows 13 creation, 14 fall, 15 about redemption. So what's he saying then about it? There's a pronoun here, she, and some scholars, and I would agree with them, trace this back through 13 and 14 to be talking about Eve. Eve will be redeemed, saved, sosa, through, and my Bible, and maybe yours, has childbearing, but interestingly, this has an article, the childbearing. Now, having an article doesn't necessarily make it specific, doesn't necessarily make us jump to capital C. When I was in the UK, they talk about going to hospital without an article. We talk about going to the hospital. neither of those are more specific than the other. We could have a specific hospital in mind with or without the article, a general hospital in mind with or without it. So the article doesn't necessarily force us to that conclusion. But Paul does tend to use the article. In fact, some would say exclusively when he uses the article in this context, in this letter, he is being specific. And given that the antecedent is Eve, it would seem that he probably is talking about the seed. In fact, the whole story of the Bible is about the seed. So instead of childbearing generally, it seems he's talking about the child who's going to come, who by the time Paul wrote this did. And then the next phrase, if they, so who's they? Well, it's Adam and Eve, but very likely Adam and Eve and all of their descendants, you and I, continue in faith, love, and holiness. And then that last phrase, with self-control. What he's really saying there is without losing your head. What he's saying is he's referring to Eve's failure. Eve lost her head there in the garden. And he's saying that what Mary did, I think, what Mary did in the childbirth is the redemptive act that both salvifically offers salvation to women, but to men too, if we continue without losing our head in the face of Satan. Now, this isn't salvation by works, because he's talking about the childbearing. It's Jesus who does it. But he calls us to keep our head and, if you will, delight in this work that God has done. And so that now, in this context, Mary's obedience, which didn't cause salvation but brought about salvation through Christ, overturns Eve's failure.
Well, I'd like to remind everyone at this point before we go on that you're listening to the Deeper Waters podcast. Everything we do here is listener supported by people like you. And friends, it's getting a point of end of the year giving. Last chance to make a donation for tax credits, things like that and such. Consider us, please. Go to deeperwatersprojects.com. Here's a link on the side. Help support the work of Deeper Waters Christian Ministries. Okay, you click on that link, all of a sudden you're taking the ministry of risen Jesus. Have you gone to the right place? Yes, you still have. That's their donation page. But Mike and Debbie Lacona are my in-laws. You make your donation, and then you get in touch with Mike or Debbie or me or Allie and say, hey, I made my donation. I want to go to Nick Peters. I want to go to Deeper Waters. That way we get the donation, and it is tax deductible. You can also buy some ebooks, ones that I've written, or I've reviewed one I've written. A Creed for the Ages, the Apostles' Creed in Today's Christian, or ones that I've co-written, just recently came out, Contextualizing Inerrancy, the sequel to Defining Inerrancy, Groundless, God and Natural Disasters, Christian Answers to This Generation's Questions, and also there's the Mentionables project that I worked with. That seems to be one of our biggest sellers here. And one other thing you can do to help us out, jewelry. We actually have a jewelry store. We have a lady who sells jewelry for us. And guys, Christmas is coming up, and Christmas can be a very romantic time. I speak from experience. I popped the question to Allie on Christmas Eve, for instance. Maybe you want to do the same thing. Well, you're going to need a ring to do that. So why not go and get a ring for us, and whatever you purchase, 25% of it goes to Deeper Waters. And guys, you know my rule I've always told you about jewelry. If your wife loves it, you can get something special for that lady in your life to make up that recent screw-up that you did with her. Or you can get something special for that lady in your life to make up that screw-up that I know you're going to make with her. Now, if you can't do any of these, guys, please go on iTunes and leave a positive review for the Deeper Waters podcast. I have no idea how much it means to me to see those. Now, Dr. Shenk, do you have an organization or charity you'd like to see people donate to?
Well, I'm part of Bethlehem Baptist Church, and we have the Bethlehem College and Seminary, which has been operating for 10 years. and that we have all of our programs are kept intentionally very low. For example, our whole MDiv is offered this year and has been for $24,000 for the whole 4 years. It's an accredited school. We're there for God's glory, and we are there to represent and train men who are students of God's Word. And glad to be a part of that, but it only works because of donations. We keep the cost very low, both for grad school and our undergrad students.
Mm-hmm. And for those listening to the show, you can be sure it's a good Orthodox school, because obviously, since Dr. Shenk's on here, we know that they affirm the virgin birth, which I do affirm. So where do they go if they want to make those donations? What's the site again?
They could just look up Bethlehem College and Seminary in Minneapolis on Google, and they'll come right to our site.
Mm-hmm. So, when we return to the First Timothy, one of the questions we can also ask is, why did Paul write this anyway? And he was just saying, hey, Tim, I've got a cool new theory. Check this out, see what you think. I mean, what was going on that led him to write this?
Well, that's a significant question, probably beyond the scope of my book. But one of the questions, obviously, has to do with, is he writing this to particular women or particular men who are causing some difficulties within the church as far as the specific role that women have. There's some real good materials on that. I'm not prepared to go into that today, though I believe that Paul was arguing for a complementarian role, that God has given us roles within marriage and within the church, and those roles are dim reflections of the kind of relations that exist within the Trinity. And a lot of times, because we're fallen on both sides, we get those messed up. I do think it goes back to the fall, when Paul said when God said to Adam and Eve, to Eve, your desire will be to manipulate your husband, and to the husband, you will become a tyrant. That's my paraphrase, but based on the use in chapter 4, verse 7 of Genesis, when God says to Cain, sin desires to have you, not to love you or to enjoy you, but to control you. But you must overthrow it. You must master it. And the same words are used there as were used against Adam and Eve. So I think what God is saying is we're really messed up. We don't enjoy the God-given roles. We're always trying to overthrow each other. And I think the context here in First Timothy is helping us to get that right.
Mm-hmm. Before we get into marriage, I'd like to know that everyone know that if you're interested in this kind of question about misogynist passages in the New Testament and such, we did have Lynn Cowick on our show one time talking about the Bible and women. So if that kind of topic interests you, go back to that show and listen to that. Now, so Mary comes along. What does Mary do that's so special, man? Exactly, because we read the text, and if we're not informed, it looks kind of simple. She just says, the angel shows up, says, here's what we want to do, and Mary's kind of like, sounds good to me, go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the difference between Mary and Eve. The Roman Catholic Church has made a lot of this, and I'm interested in your discussion next week, Nick. I think one of the things that's happened is we've been afraid to delight in Mary. Of course, Mary herself said that we will, in her Magnificat, that we should always be speaking well of the servant of God, as we do for Moses and the prophets. But we're a little bit afraid to, as protesters, as Protestants, maybe to put a distance between us and what worries us as looking like a worship of a person, and we certainly shouldn't do that. But there are real important similarities in these stories, which are intentional on God's part. That is not how the stories are written, but how the stories were choreographed, if you will, by God and through His Spirit. So that what we see in Eve in the garden is Eve is in a perfect situation. And in that perfect situation, she acts foolishly and gullibly and ultimately against God. And yet, In contrast, we have Mary in a difficult situation, living in Nazareth in a day of Roman domination and relative poverty. And in that context, she meets with an angelic being, and she's not gullible at all. She's skeptical. How can this be, she says. Eve didn't say that. Eve's first words are half agreeing and half disagreeing with Satan, which is exactly where he wanted her to be. And then she looked at the opportunity and she chose that over God. It started to look really good to disobey God. Eve, after she asked that tough question, how many people would ask that of an angel? How can this be? It sounds almost demanding, almost impertinent.
You mean Mary?
Did I switch it? Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
That impertinence was actually a good thing. And when she heard the angel's answer, Mary said, "Let it be to me as you have said." And that let it be to me, exactly the opposite of Eve, who said, "I'm getting what I want." Mary was giving up, as she thought, everything she wanted. She was imagining giving up her husband. She was imagining being grieving her parents. She was imagining the names that people would call her. And so even though she delights, her response is delight in God, that says who she was compared to Eve, and really compared to most of us who are afraid to give up anything at God's command. But the distinction between these two is another indication of how Mary redeems Eve, redeems women's reputation, if you will, because seen through Eve, the reputation of women was with her gullible, naive, and deceived. But the reputation through Mary, the one who brought about the childbirth by God's mercy and grace, is one who's obedient and delighting in God, and both of them conceiving by ear. One conceived by ear, sin, and the other conceived by ear and said, "Let it be to me as you say," and brought forth the childbirth.
Mm-hmm. So what does that mean then for women today and our view of women, how we should treat them in the church?
Well, it certainly means that we should treat them in light of all of us in redemption are to be seeing ourselves as God does, ones who are now adopted and who are delighting in the right things and in the right way. And that's partly what it means to become a Christian. We become a Christian only by the blood of Christ and by faith. But having become a Christian, we've now adopted right loves. And a right love is to love the things God loves, first of which is delighting in him and obedience to him. And so women can be seen in light of Mary, and Mary becomes a kind of role model. We need role models. And although Mary doesn't join the Trinity, she's not a savior, we don't worship her, she certainly is one that men and women can look to and say, wow, that's the kind of person I want to be in Christ.
And my sound guy, whenever he does my show, he tells me he always loves it when I start talking about my wife on the air. Yeah, he loves it and he hates it because he says, it's so great how much you're devoted to it, but it always makes the rest of us look really bad. My thing is I go on Facebook 6 days a week. I don't post on Sundays. And every day I post a marriage meme and a love message to my wife every single day. And one of the things I've said before, because I'm very much a complementarian in my approach, but I've also said, look, I hold a complementarianism, but if a man is the king of his castle, his wife gets treated like a queen.
Well, it's a good way to approach it, Nick.
Mm-hmm. So now one of the other things you also say about the significance of a doctrine is you talk about our own virgin birth. And I'm sure people hear me out saying, I'm sorry, but I think I know how my parents brought me into this world, and it wasn't through a virgin birth.
Well, as I mentioned before, in John 1, writing a good prologue, like any good author of music, He puts all the themes in his prologue, and he does that in John 1:12 and 13, when speaking both of Christ's birth as well as our own, says, "But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, not of the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God." And now this idea comes into dialogue when Jesus is meeting with Nicodemus. And in meeting with Nicodemus, he holds Nicodemus accountable for not understanding this. And this is driving Nicodemus crazy. He says, "How can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb?" And Jesus keeps back at him, "Unless one is born, water and spirit, he can't enter the kingdom of God." And Nicodemus' response again is, "How can these things be?" But Jesus says, "You're Israel's teacher, and you don't get this? You should understand." He says, "Don't marvel at this, that you must be born again. The wind blows wherever it wills. You hear its sound. You do not know where it comes from or where it is going, but so it is with everyone who's born of the Spirit." So Jesus is saying to Nicodemus that we too are those who are virgin born. That is, through no desire of our own and impossible on human terms.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Was that it, or?
That can be.
It sounded like you were going for a little bit more.
No, I could. Jesus is probably referencing Ezekiel 36. And here where God is saying that the Spirit is the one who animates and gives real life to his people. He could be also talking about the new covenant in Jeremiah. He could be talking about, and in fact is, the circumcision that God does of our heart that Moses talks about in Deuteronomy. So all of these things are, the ground is laid in the Old Testament. And we already know that the Spirit is the one who gives life. We saw that in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, when the Spirit was hovering over the waters. And then similarly, we saw that the Spirit is the one who's hovering over Mary in Luke 1:35. And now we see in John that the Spirit is the one who hovers over us and gives us life. We don't do it. This is God alone who comes and gives us life. Our response is to, like Mary, respond in joy and delight and say, God is the one who does this. But this is, in that sense, a virgin birth. This is God doing it on his own, not through any means we could understand, manipulate, or cause of ourselves.
Now, when we were talking about this idea of the new birth coming through something outside ourselves and such, you referenced John 3, so I take it you probably don't think that Jesus is talking about baptism in that passage like many people in church history have thought.
Yeah, I've seen that discussion. I just don't think that fits into what Jesus is saying here. It certainly doesn't fit into the response of Nicodemus. So water and the Spirit, which he says in verse 5, seems to me, and fits with the Old Testament story, not of baptism, but of you're born of water, but you must be born of the Spirit. Fitting again to what he says, back in verse 3. And then he goes on to say, let me explain what birth Spirit is. It's done by the Holy Spirit. Yes, it could be, and there's some good scholars who think that this is talking about baptism, but that doesn't seem to be fundamentally fitting. But even if it is, God's saying, I do the real deal. It is the Spirit who gives life. There has to be this unilateral work of God by the Spirit that allows us to say Jesus is Lord. That without the Spirit, we're not going to do that.
And in case you're curious for your own information, I don't think it refers to baptism either, but it would seem fitting with what you're saying, because when we read about the coming of Christ into the world and things of that sort, it's almost like it's what I refer to as the grand reverser, as it were, that death had reigned, as Paul says, and then life starts to reign all the way up to the resurrection, which we could kind of consider the crescendo moment, as it were, the climax of history, where things all of a sudden start turning around.
Yes, I agree.
And what would you say then? Does this have any impact on, say, our interpretation of the last two chapters of the Book of Revelation?
Well, I would say it the other way. The last two chapters of the Book of Revelation govern any exegesis. It governs our hermeneutics, because that is the telos, and everything that we're learning, understanding, doing is governed by the final act of God within time, or if you will, the first act of God outside of time, the new creation. So specifically what you mean, I'm not quite sure, but I could certainly sign on to it. But you probably have something more specific in mind, Nick.
I kind of have the whole idea that Revelation 21-22 is kind of the ultimate end of the whole new life thing, that this is resurrection of not just us eventually, but what I call resurrection cosmos, as it were. New heavens and new earth.
That's right.
Made, and it's my stipulation. It's not that God just said, "Oh, dang it, the heavens, the earth was ruined. We're going to have to start all over again." But He doesn't do away with heaven and earth. He gives them a new birth, much like He gives to us. That everything gets reversed in a sense. That all, I mean, aside from, I'm not endorsing anything like universalism of sorts, but I just mean that creation is restored to what God originally meant it to be, but it starts with us.
Well, I would say almost. In other words, we talked about chiasms, and the idea here is that there was an original creation and a crisis. So chapter 1 and 2, creation culminating in a marriage, interestingly, and then the fall. And then the rest of the Old Covenant is about the effects of that fall and the promise of a solution, coming out of Genesis 3:15. And then the incarnation, which we've been talking about today, is the second creation. The death of Christ is the second crisis. Interestingly, there's also in that two grouping, there's also a second creation, which is parallel to Christ's birth. We get out of the resurrection and the cross, we get the birth of a new people, the church, which you were referring to a moment ago. And then the third creation, which you rightly said is a kind of recreation. It's not de novo like the first. Begins with a crisis, the judgment, which is parallel to the fall of Adam and Eve. And then the final recreation in Genesis 1 and 2, or I'm sorry, in Revelation 21 and 22, is parallel to the first creation. But this third creation isn't just restoring, and like you said, it's certainly not another try. It is actually reflected through this amazing work of God on the cross, which instead of bringing coercive power, He brought the stunning power of suffering evil and trusting God. You know, he did something that nobody could have anticipated. In fact, so unanticipatable was that the apostles, no matter how often they were told what was going to happen, said, no, that's not going to happen. Until afterwards, finally, they begin to get it. And so what God is doing is this three-stage creation to bring us from where Adam could never be to our eternal Romans 8 destiny of being freely conforming. You know, that's the argument of Romans 8, is we're not only free, but we're conforming. Free in 20 and 21, conforming in 28 and 29 of Romans 8. And that freely conforming is just that stunning final move of God in which, like the first marriage, there's a last marriage.
Yeah, the Bible is really the story of a marriage taking place in a garden, both times, and the garden theme is so essential. But something else that I think about is, since you referenced Romans 8, which is one of the most wonderful chapters, I think, in Scripture, that I've been involved some of a debate about who's Paul talking about before in Romans 7. Is he talking about himself or someone else? I tend to go with Ben Witherington's position, but he's talking about Adam. And something I've said is, if we identify way too much with Romans 7, we will miss the good news that our true identity as Christians is found in Romans 8.
Yeah, with modification, I think that's right. If he's talking about Adam, I think Paul's also talking about his own experience in this sense that Romans 7 can't be speaking about non-Christians because Paul says he delights in the law. It can't be talking about Christians because he says he's still a slave to sin. I think he's talking about that middle category, which is not yet Christians, those who are elect eternally, but temporally just waking up to it, and yet haven't in time crossed the line. And this was Paul, if you will, on his Damascus road, fighting with himself and fighting with God until he gets knocked off of his transportation onto the ground. And it's this confrontation with Jesus, which is wonderfully short because Paul's already been prepared. He loves the law. He wants to obey, and he can't. And then Jesus says, stop working against me. You're going to work with me. You're going to be with me in the front lines. And so I think talking about his own experience, who will save me from this body of death. But thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. There's therefore now no condemnation to those who are Christ Jesus. So Romans 7 is a not yet Christian experience. So maybe Adam, sure. I think more specifically Paul. And Romans 8 is our chapter. If we want to know the tension of not always being who we want to be, we go to Galatians 5, where it says the Spirit contends with our bias to work against him. That's there in Romans 5, and yeah, we've all experienced that, but it's not there in Romans 7.
Mm-hmm. So I think then what we need to realize about the virgin birth ultimately is the virgin birth of Christ is an event that happened in the past. It's not going to happen like that ever again. Christ is never going to be born again, as it were. But that it happened to Christ means that God's capable of bringing new spiritual life to all of us as well.
And interestingly, you started this interview with asking about Paul and if there's any hints in Paul. We talked about Galatians, but also Galatians 4:19. I labor always until Christ is born in you, which sounds very much like a comparison between Christ's virgin birth and our virgin birth. That is, Christ born in you, as if we're married, and as if God is doing this by himself, male and female alike. So I like that verse too. It's a great metaphor that Paul ties into, which I think is again his ascent to the virgin birth and giving it a fuller meaning in us. Mm-hmm. But never again. That's right. Never again, unless you see it in us, in God doing this. We are the metaphor for the real thing, but the real thing only happened once. But it's real in us. It's just not. It is God showing again His power to create on His own authority, not in ours.
Mm-hmm. So now we've got Christmas time here, with just around the corner. There's going to be so many pageants and such going on about Christianity. We're going to have several school children and churches putting on these plays and such. What do you think? What do you want people to be thinking about the story of a virgin birth when they see it announced in these shows?
Sure, I'd be pleased if they ask God to show what's a drama that they're supposed to enact once they believe the virgin birth. It's pretty, it's cute. We love to see our kids. We like to hear the story. It's comforting. But that is not the reason he gave it. Those may be entailments that we like and thank God for. But really, he is calling for us to figure out the drama we're to put on. Galatians 4:19 is an example of the drama. Doing the work of discipleship, that Christ may be born in others. It might go with, are we willing to be a fool? 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Are we willing to be a fool for God trusting that God is doing this impossible thing of calling people to himself who don't want him. And are we on the front lines with Jesus? He doesn't need us, but boy, we get this privilege of being on the front lines, that Christ would be born in others. So, yeah, I think I want people to be asking, what is the drama that we as a church are supposed to put on when we get the birth? Not just enjoy the pretty lights and the scenes and the story as if it was only a 2,000-year-old story. It certainly is a truth from 2,000 years ago that our whole life depends on, but we're supposed to enact it today.
You know, when you were talking about being seen as fools and such, I just suddenly remembered that years ago, David Letterman was interviewing Larry King, and he asked him, if there was anyone you could interview, past, present, such, who would it be? And Larry King immediately said, Jesus Christ. It's really, what would you ask him? He said, it's one question. I would ask him if he was born of a virgin. That question to me, that answer would explain all of history at that point.
I'm not surprised. I hadn't heard that story before, but I'm not surprised. That's we know that history turns in this. We changed our whole calendar because of it. This is the turning point of history. It is when God says, I'm keeping my word. I really did not just create and let it fall apart. I created and I redeem.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's also been said before, when it comes to Jesus, we can look at him as either one of two ways. He is either the Son of God or he is the son of Joseph.
Yeah, that's right. And if he's the son of Joseph, he is not a redeemer.
Mm-hmm. So really, it really just does come down all to this question. And it's not just God showing off. It's everything. It's if Jesus is born of a virgin, and sometimes people ask me, well, why do you believe that? And say, well, once you believe the resurrection of Christ, believing of a virgin birth just seems to come along quite naturally with that. And I think even someone like William Lane Craig said at one point, one of the drives of his skepticism was a virgin birth when he was a teenager, but then then at one point thought, well, if I came to conclude that God could create an entire universe, a virgin birth isn't that big of a big deal for him.
That's right.
Now, if people get the book here, what do you really want them to take away from the book?
Again, I think my answer would be the same to the last question. I want to motivate them to figure out the drama that they are to put on as part of the church. What's their response? Don't just believe it. Like, don't just say it's true. Live it out. And what's that look like? I suggested 6 ways, but I think there's 6 times 60 ways, and God will continue by His Spirit to show us how we're to live that drama.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to let people know that when you're on my page, you'll see a lot of jokes and humor and such, and the story behind the virgin birth joke thing that we got going is rather amusing. It's got a good point to it, but it in no way means the virgin birth is a joke. It is a serious doctrine, and I'm quite thankful that I've got Dr. Shenk's book here and went through it. It really is very eye-opening to many things we normally wouldn't think about. And there is more, I'm sure we could say, but we have come up to the time where we have to be cutting things off here. Now, if you do want to buy the book, it's The Virgin Birth of Christ by Richard Shenk. I'm sure he wouldn't object to you buying the one by Gresham Machen as well, but it is The Virgin Birth of Christ with his name on it. So the paperback version, as of the time of recording, paperback on Amazon, $14.99. Kindle version, $9.99. Now, Dr. Shenk, do you have a blog, a website, an email where people can get in touch if they want to find out more?
I do not, but I try. I have a mild aversion to social media, but I can be reached at either of 2 websites. I'll give you my personal one because it's easier than the Bethlehem one. The personal one is just Rick Shenk, no punctuation, RickShenk at Gmail. Mm-hmm. But if they go to the Bethlehem College and Seminary website, they can find me under faculty and just click through and not even need to remember that.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave for the Deeper Waters audience today?
I'm just grateful to you for giving me the time to talk about something that's far more important to God than you and I have yet realized.
I'm very grateful to have you on here, and of course, we still have to know, do you still affirm the virgin birth, which I do affirm?
You and I do together, and God before us.
Mm-hmm. But I'd like to remind everyone that next week on the show, we are going to have Tim Perry on talking about his book, Mary or Evangelicals. How should evangelical Christians look at Mary? I mean, we might think the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church go too far, but are we making the opposite mistake of going too short? That's going to be next week. For now, I am Nick Peters, and I'm signing off, and I affirm the virgin birth.